And I'm the Education Director at the Johnson County Historical Society. And we're here today for our April History for Lunch, but I always get the opportunity to do a couple of quick announcements and commercials. First commercial I want to do is that we're having a new exhibit opening on April 18th. The next exhibit at the Heritage Museum is on 50 years of teenagers in Johnson County and in the United States. The exhibit introduces the idea that there wasn't really a separate culture of teenagers until after World War II. And it takes this generation of people and shows the different fads and experiences they go through, both to compare what's similar as well as what's different with each 10 years of people. So I encourage everyone to come. The opening is on the 18th. Leslie Brainerd, who's a long-term Iowa City high school teacher over at West 5, who teaches a course on American teenagers, is going to be at the presentation speaking about teenagers and teenagerism. And I encourage you to come by. The exhibit will be up through the summer, so you'll have ample time to come see it. From Grove, our site that's on Kirkwood Ave, which is the first territorial governor's retirement home. I always have to make sure I get the phrasing right. Opens on May 28th, so if you're interested in coming down and seeing Plum Grove, that's your opportunity to begin for the summer. It's open Wednesday through Sunday afternoons throughout the summer up through the end of October. So please take a chance to an opportunity to come see it. If you haven't seen it before, it's a wonderful home to visit, as well as heritage gardens of plantings that are generally pre-1850s, sometimes a little bit more advanced, but I'd say definitely pre-1900s. It's also an opportunity to come see archaeological digs that are done there, as well as archaeological exhibits. So it's a great opportunity to spend an entire afternoon at a site. We have a program on April 23rd for families, which is called Satellites and Technology Breakthroughs for the 1950s. We're going to be taking families up to the observatory in Hills to see the old reception station and telescopes that were there that Dr. Van Allen had put there when he did his research here. It's a great opportunity to come out and take a view of the moon that evening. It's a Friday night. If you're interested in doing that, give me a call so I can get you directions and I can get you registered so I know how many people I have on the roof of this building before the evening begins. My last quick announcement is that next month's History for Lunch, which was on the history of the Northside Business District, has been postponed at this point. There's been some catches in it, and we're not going to be able to provide that walking tour in May. We're hoping to do it in the fall with no further commercials. Today's speaker is Sunday Antrim. She has been with the Heritage Gardens tasting at Plum Grove, which is a wonderful annual event where you get to come taste different samples of products that were made with the plants that were grown in the gardens there. She's been with it since the onset. It's now going to be in its fourth year this year, whether working with us. And it's usually the end of July, beginning of August, that period. So watch for publicity. It's a wonderful chance to come down and taste things you may have never had before. Otherwise, she's an experienced master gardener, a very nice person to come and spend the afternoon with us, and an enthusiast. I'd like you to take a chance to listen to her and then taste her wonderful food samples. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a very nice introduction. Thank you for that. Well, I want to tell you that I have had a lot of fun preparing for this program. I've had the opportunity to talk to a number of friends that I know, and they were just more than willing to share experiences that they've had, sort of remember what it was like when they visited their grandparents. And then I've read several autobiographies, and some of those books are in the back. You can look at those. One is written by a lady basically from Cedar Rapids, and they have just been very nice to read and brings back a lot of memories and thoughts. As I go through the program, I would love to have you share your own experiences and remembrances. What I would like to do is, as I go through the timeline, you will think of things, and I want you to jot down on the paper, on this first sheet that we have. You might, with a pen or pencil, jot down when your parents lived and when your grandparents lived. And that will sort of help you put in perspective the type of life that they lived in. And there are several copies of this in the back and some over by the food. If you haven't tried the food, please go ahead and do so. Several of the recipes are recipes that we used at Plum Grove at the Taste of the Heritage Garden. The raspberry candy is from Betty Kelly. Aunt Millie's carrot pudding is one that I had made for last year, and I think I did it over a dozen times last year for that event. Also, I made a corn dish, and this is from dried corn, mainly because the dried flavor is quite different than eating just fresh corn. And the other dish is chow chow. And this is a type of pickling that the lady of the house might have done at the end of the season to finish using all of the vegetables and not let them waste. The recipes are some that we've collected as a committee for the Taste of the Heritage Garden. Also, I did quite a bit of research at the Sasmary cookbook collection at the main library. And this is in the special collections room. If you ever have a chance to go there, it's on the third floor of the library. Go in, spend an afternoon. They can look up books for you. There's a whole collection of Iowa cookbooks. They are the real cookbooks. They're splattered with grease, water, juice, but it's just a great joy. You cannot take them out of the library, but you can look at the cookbooks that people collected and then donated to this. So now if you've sort of thought about, yes?
You mean the university library when you say the library?
The main university library.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's on third floor.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So now if you've sort of thought in the timeline where you've placed your parents and your grandparents, I will just go over the timeline quickly and point out a few things that were extremely important. As you can see from the subtitle, we've gone from a hanging pot over the fireplace to almost the era where one could go to the stove, turn on the burner, and put it on medium, low, high. You could set the oven at 350 and bake your bread. So this is a tremendous change in this era. In the 1800s, we're going to start with fireplaces. There were not stoves yet. We only had fireplaces. What they used for refrigeration was spring houses and ice houses. In the 1940s, wooden machinery that was pulled by horses was available that the men made. However, in 1947, John Deere developed a steel plow. And this was a great advantage because it didn't break, it was stronger, it made life much easier. The first real steam mill to grind grain was in Davenport in 1948. Before that, we used windmills or water power from falls or a hand grinder. Jane?
I want to get used to saying 18 instead of 19.
Am I saying 19? I'm sorry. Okay. I think I did this when I was going over this also. Okay. In 1860, John Mason put on the market his canning jar. And that was another time that cooking changed. The whole method of preparation and preserving food changed at that point. In 1870, an icebox was available. And also at that time, the first railroad was completed across the United States. So it was at that point that produce could be shipped from New York to Iowa, or grain from Iowa to go to California or to Texas. In 1880, one of the major changes was the development of the small electric motor. And this made it possible to have mechanical refrigeration and eventually gas and electric refrigeration. The stove with temperature control was really not available until 1915. So it's just a little bit beyond this era, but it's close. In my trying to determine how to set this program up, I was trying to decide, do I just talk about cooking, utensils, the recipes? And then I decided, I said to myself, what do they have? What do these people have to work with? So I decided to block it out in an organization of tools, supplies, and methods. And hopefully we'll cover most everything. I think now you might imagine that, well, we'll speak about tools first. You might imagine that the husband has already chopped the wood, it's outside, it's been split. Last night, the children brought the wood into the house, so it's ready in the morning. The children also brought water in, so that's ready for the morning also. Now, if you can picture yourself, you've got a long denim dress on, and it's loose. It's loose, it's not tight, it's loose, and you have a long denim apron on. The dress also served as a maternity dress because there was no difference. And if you're picturing and wondering what happened to the calico dresses, well, they were used on Sunday or special occasions. They were not used in every day. So you can picture yourself there, you've got your long denim dress on, and over the fireplace, you're hanging your pot. You've got a big cast iron black pot, and you're hanging that and starting the day. The fire, you've already started the fire. With the fireplace, the first ones had lug poles, and this was a bar that went from side to side of the fireplace, and it was wooden. It was made out of new wood, and of course, you can imagine having wood over a fire. This was not real satisfactory. Sometimes the pot would pull it, eventually it would dry and burn through, but that's what they had. However, as soon as the blacksmith set up in a vicinity near you, you went to wrought iron, and that's when the swinging crane came in, and that was built into the side, to one side of the fireplace, probably the right-hand side. Now you can hang your pots from this. It's got hooks on it, and you can hang your pot here, then you can swing it back and forth. You can swing it out, tend your fire here, add wood, stir it up. You can swing it back in, take some ashes, put them over here in the hearth, make several different piles, because you have several different dishes for dinner. With this fireplace, there would be a broiler, and this is a little hand instrument. Everything is made out of wrought iron that you could put your meat in and hold it over the fire. Toaster, in which you would stand the bread upright and then turn it after it had toasted. And you had andirons. And the andirons partially served to rotisserie food. So you would put a steel bar across, and then you could turn it by hand and rotisserie your roast. Or there was a little device called a jack, and you would wind it up like a jack-in-the-box, and then attach it to this bar, and it would turn your roast for you. Then when it finished, you'd take it off and wind it up again. Beside the fireplace on the left-hand side, usually up above, was a bee-high oven, and this is where you made your bread. In the oven, you would put the hot ashes in here, let the oven heat up, and when you thought it was about right, you would scrape them out, and then with this long peel, with a flat end, you would put your bread on it and then shove it into the bee-high oven. If things are not going well today and your bread is not baking correctly, you had a salamander. And this is another instrument on a long pole. You would put this in the ashes and heat it up, then stick it in the top of the oven and hold it, and perhaps the top of your bread would cook a little bit better.
That was called a salamander?
Salamander. Mm-hmm. At this point, most of the tools, the pots, are cast iron of all sizes. There would be kettles for soups, for stews. There would be baking dishes, just normal size. Some had flat lids that were flanged on the side, and you could put ashes on the top so you could cook from both the bottom in the top. Most of these pots for the fireplace had feet so that they could set over your piles of ashes. And if your pot didn't have feet, there were trivets. And the trivets ranged from short to tall, and you would put those over the ashes, and then your pot on top of that. Later on, there were more pots and pans. There would be brass, there would be copper. They were lighter. They were just much easier to use. In the beginning, most of the buckets and the pots would have been wooden. I guess I didn't bring. I have a wooden bread bowl that I brought, and these were usually started as round, but they are made out of one piece of wood, so that as time goes on, they shrink, and they become oval. And I checked mine when I learned that. And this one, which is from central Iowa, near Des Moines, is 18 and a half inches by 17 and a quarter. So I'm believing it's truly authentic. This is one that my mother had given me. Buckets also were wooden at first. For refrigeration, we had spring houses. And these houses were built over a spring in the, good, someone's shaking their head, yes, over a spring. So it was very important you were near water, and the springs would always be cool. So it would be a wooden structure, I don't know, just a small house. Let's say maybe the size of what children might like as a playhouse over the spring. And then you would put perhaps dairy products or some meat and store them there. Later on, there would be ice houses. My husband told me an interesting story. When he was in high school, he worked for Hubbard Ice in Cedar Rapids, and he said, Hubbard Ice did this right here. The men would go out in the winter to the Cedar River, and they had these enormous saws. They would saw into the water, into the ice, and make squares, and then bring them up on tongs. They had brought out the wagons with horses, put them on here. Then there's a 5-story building in downtown Cedar Rapids, and they would store the ice in, not ashes, but in sawdust. And they would keep it there and then deliver it wherever was needed. But I found it interesting that he felt like he was a part of that. And they would use this ice also later on when ice boxes became available. And I was thinking that a 50-pound block of ice would be about this size, something that you could easily pick up with tongs, but I don't know how often you needed to fill the ice box. It was once a week or twice a week? Twice a week? Twice a week. In the summer? Okay, twice a week. So I think that kept people very busy delivering this ice. One of the other houses that they had outdoors was a smokehouse. And here, not everyone had smokehouses, but this was up to the family. You know, if you had a large family, a small family, it might depend on whether you lived out in the country or if you lived in town. If you lived near a community or in town, perhaps you did not have a smokehouse because you could go to the general store a little easier. But the smokehouse was usually fired up in the spring or the summer, and it would have been hardwood that was used so that there would be a good aroma, and also the hardwood would last a little bit longer than the softwood. We had a root cellar, and this could either be under the house or it would be in a cave beside the house. I grew up in a house that had the cave in a hill beside the house. Yeah, it was just a little walk outdoors, but it was really neat for a child to play in, to go in and come out of. And there they would store vegetables from the garden and also canned goods. Another thing that they stored there was eggs. And this was something that was totally new to me. They would take the eggs and they would grease them. They would cover them with grease and then pack them in straw and store them in the root cellar. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. That was a totally new idea for me, and thought that may go back. I don't know. I was thinking that perhaps the grease sealed the pores on the egg, and they would keep longer.
I would have thought most people would sell or use up their eggs.
A lot of people did do that because they would take them to the general store and buy them. But this was one method of storing them. And if you had apples, you probably wrapped them in a sheet of paper individually and stored them in a bin. Another tool was horses and oxen because we needed them to pull the cart back and forth from town, and you needed the horses to pull the plow. And you had a question?
No, I was going to say that I remember storing to keep cool down in a well.
Oh, okay, in a well.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was like a space on top.
Oh, a space on top.
I mean, the water was, it wasn't in the water.
Above?
The water.
My mother mentioned storing things in a well, and she said the well they had was big like this, and they would put dairy products in a bucket and crank it down right above the water. And the only thing she said was the real serious situation here is if you spill the milk in the well, then you've you've lost the well. Yes, you've lost the water. So you did have to be very careful there. Also, there were warm cellars, and there are a few vegetables, and I'm a little bit unclear about this. I've read both ways with the root cellars, which are kept probably underground around 55, something like that. But there are some vegetables like beets and carrots that could be kept in perhaps a room off of the kitchen somewhere that did not perish because they were warmer. In the 1840s, the cook stove appeared. And for all of you that have been to Plum Grove, they have a small stove, and it's a stove, the top's about this high, but the stove itself is small and it's very low like this. And this was adapted so that people could bring these big kettles from the fireplace and just put them right on the stove, and then it's still just about waist high, so you could still easily cook with them. It was a little later on that they had the larger stoves, and they became higher, and at that point you had lighter utensils, maybe more brass, more copper, maybe aluminum, and they were higher. It was just simpler, much lighter, much easier on each person.
What provided the heat for a cook stove?
A cook stove was wood, usually wood.
You're still using wood?
Yeah, we're still using wood. This would be small pieces of wood. They would be split. And in the summer, the fire would be let go down. So each day you would maybe bring in some corn cobs or little splinters and start them, and then put the wood in. Then you wouldn't really start cooking until after the fire had died down a little bit. And you controlled that with there's an air vent in the front of the stove, and also on the flue going up. Yeah, and that went into the chimney. That would be the other place. It's my understanding you let it go until smoke comes out of the flue, and then you start adjusting and setting it down. These stoves were at a size that they could be put into the fireplace in the beginning, and then the chimney right up, the pipes right up the chimney. And then a little bit later they were brought out and then piped into the chimney, maybe somewhere else or out another direction. Then in the 1870s, the icebox did appear. Our ladies enjoyed gadgets. They had lots of gadgets. Do you have a question?
Our stove had a water reservoir.
Did it have a water reservoir? Be on the right-hand side? Okay, did that go inside? It was on...
Inside the firebox.
Okay, on the firebox, so that's... Okay.
That's the firebox, and it would heat water. We never used it because we lived in town and we had
You had water.
cold water, but I remember the stove had the water.
Okay.
We often speak of a wood cook stove, When did they switch from wood to coal in those type of stoves?
That I can't tell you, but I would think that that might be an area situation. I'm not sure. I did not read if they used coal here, and maybe you can answer that for me. I know my mother grew up in Tennessee, and my grandmother used coal. And a lot of times it was coal or it was coke.
Yes.
So the coke was more compressed coal, and it was not as smoky as coal, and it was not so dirty.
A lot of times in the evening, rather than heating up the whole stove, we just make a fire with corn husks on the farm. And that was enough to make your meal, and that was very valuable.
And that was enough. Well, I think that the wood is probably very precious, and so that would be a good way to do that. Everyone loves gadgets, and the ladies and wives had lots of gadgets. They had fun. Anything that's sort of fun, makes your life a little easier, is a joy. They had cherry pitters, apple peelers, flour presses, whisks, waffle irons, and I've seen two types of flour presses. One is in a rectangular box with a roller, and you just rolled it back and forth. And another one is like an iron that you put the pedal in it. It's a round iron. You put the pedal in it and then close the lid. So that was two types. Are there other types of gadgets that you can think of? I mean, there must be tons of them.
How did you get the moisture out when you compress it between two pieces of metal?
It was probably warm, but not warm enough to singe it. When I made, for the Taste of the Heritage Garden last summer, I made cookies. They were sugar cookies with pansies in them. After I'd cut them, I put the pansy right on top and then sugared it, and then baked them for 12 minutes in a normal oven. And the pansies never turned brown, they never wrinkled. They came out fresh, which really sort of amazed me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Supplies. One of the first supplies that we need is water, and that was extremely important. Probably if you did not live in town, you lived close to a water supply. You either lived by a spring, a creek, a river, a lake. You had to live near something so that you could function. Also, wood was very important, so you needed a source of wood. The women were in charge of the garden, and this was also another important item. The garden was done the very first thing in the spring. The men would plow up maybe half an acre, and this would be right beside the house. And then the woman would take over. She would do all the planting, weeding, watering, picking, and then harvesting at the end. That was her domain, and the children would help with this. In the back of your packet is an example of the garden at Plum Grove last year, and that garden is done in squares. The other method would have been to just line it out in rows, like we do now. In that garden, in the vegetable garden, you would perhaps have beets, carrots, parsnips, turnips, radishes, potatoes, cabbage, squash, celery, pumpkins. The main thing is that you have things that will keep. And there might have been a few tomatoes, but it needs to be things that you can use and then store and keep, because what you grew in your garden sort of, depended on how you lived during the winter. So you needed to store enough. Also, there were probably a few herbs grown in this garden. Okay, herbs. The other garden would have been a flower garden. They liked pretty things, and this would have been normally a separate garden and would give great joy. And then some of the flowers were used in cooking, which still sort of a surprise to me. The other source of food would have been an orchard, and not everyone had orchards. Plum Grove had a plum orchard, and they used those. A lot of people had apple orchards. And the apple orchards were quite important. from your apples, you had apples to eat, you dried the apples, you had apple cider, and you had vinegar. And the vinegar was an extremely important product from the apples, and usually they just made their own. And I remember the first time I saw a mother in my mother's vinegar. It was this. If you remember these dark blobs in your vinegar, that was a very important part of the vinegar because that kept it going and made it turn into vinegar. With the apple orchard at the harvesting time, they would have Applebee's, and the neighbors and friends and relatives would get together. You'd pick the apples, and then you would peel them, core them, and slice them up. Then you could dry them on racks outdoors, or I have seen pictures where they dried them on pegs indoors. I think the outdoor method would probably be a little more, work just a little bit better. With crops, the men were probably growing wheat. Maybe corn, but mainly wheat. Corn was not real popular at that time, early on, because it did not produce large ears of corn like we have seen large ears of corn full of bright yellow or white corn. That wasn't the case then, and it wasn't until a little bit later on that this was the case. So probably they planted wheat, and they would harvest it. They would have their threshing times. This was another exciting time. Maybe 12 men would get together, and they would do this. They might be at one home for a week, or maybe not that long, couple days. They would harvest this, and then there would always be the big meals, the big special times, the big meals. And I'm sure some of you remember the threshing times. Did it last like 3 days or a week?
I thought it was longer.
Was it longer? I'm sure it may vary from farm to farm.
Well, my dad had a threshing machine,
Mm-hmm.
and they would go from farm to farm.
They would go from farm to farm. I'm thinking of one house for maybe a couple days, and then another house for a couple days. Yeah.
I don't. I remember the threshing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have any of you been to the thrashing festival in Mount Pleasant? Yeah, the reunion. That's quite interesting. We took my father-in-law 2 years ago, and I was not familiar with all these machines, so that was quite interesting to see how they worked and how cantankerous they are at times. Cattle was a very important supply. If you lived in town, you might not have cattle, but if you did live out, you probably had cows. And all of the animals that you had, you probably kept and used until they either no longer produced milk or they no longer completed the function that you needed, and then you would butcher them. But the cows were used for milk, and then from there you would have butter and cheese, and then later they would be slaughtered. Pigs were used, and from the pigs we've got the meat, we've got suet, which is necessary for cooking, and the suet was melted down for soap. And then the intestines of the pig was used, and that was important to clean them and then get them ready if you wanted to make sausage out of some of the odds and ends of the meat. And so then you had this sausage stuffer that you could use for that. Do you have a question?
I had a question. We
Uh-huh.
were out at Living History Farms yesterday.
Uh-huh.
We were at the 1850s Pioneer Farm, and he told us that the people at that time didn't really drink milk. And I had never heard that before. He said they used it for cheese and cottage cheese or the butter, but that they didn't drink it. He said it was a kind of their custom. Did you read anything?
I did not read anything that they did not drink the milk. I know that, well, would they have used the milk for cooking then? Because for the butter and cheese, you've skimmed off the cream to use. So you've got all of this milk.
He said they used it.
The pigs? The skim milk to the pigs. Well, maybe it's possible then that they didn't. That was something that I had not read that.
They drank the buttermilk.
But they drank the buttermilk, and this was the liquid from the butter, as you know, what was left from the butter. That's interesting.
We drink the milk right from the
the cow.
Yeah, I have seen that, I've seen that done.
Well, part of what would enter into that, the reason is the lack of refrigeration.
Right.
So, you know, if you did drink it fresh, that's okay, but you couldn't keep it long enough
To make it
wait,
worthwhile.
not just go to the refrigerator.
Mm-hmm. Well, my mother talks about they kept their milk in the well, and she said if you were really careful, it would keep maybe most of a day, which is not very long. So maybe it was simply easier to give it to the pigs, and then you've got a good, healthy pig. Oh.
There's a tin cup by the pump.
Yeah.
You always drink water,
Yeah.
have these cheese.
But you would have a supply, I mean, they'd milk the cow in the morning, they'd milk the cow at night. So I don't think keeping it,
Was
I
not a
know
problem.
we did pasteurize it for a long time.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm. That was an interesting point in the timeline. There's a note that it's Francis Apert started the first canning idea, and he did not know why, when he cooked the vegetables and then put them in a clean jar, why they seemed to stay better. And it wasn't until Louis Pasteur, when he pasteurized, that they really realized the full reason for that you had killed all the bacteria. From the poultry, they had poultry, you'd have meat and eggs, and then sheep, you would have food, and they used the fat, and you would have wool, so you could spin if they did do spinning. Other provisions came from the general store. You did need salt, sugar, flour if you did not grow it and take it to a mill yourself, and fabric. Spices that were used were pepper, nutmeg, mace, cloves, ginger, and cinnamon. And perhaps you could buy a type of baking soda which is called saleratus. And if I pronounced that correctly, saleratus, it was a commercial type of baking soda. Okay, and the other would have been pearl ash, which is baking powder. And these were not real good items because if you used them, there were not set amounts you would use. So you would at times get green streaking and yellow streaking through your bread. It was not a real satisfactory method. The men did hunt. There would be venison, rabbits, turkey, fish, and what was most plentiful in our area were prairie chickens. And I don't know if anyone remembers prairie chickens, but that seems to be the one item that they said of early on. There were a lot of them. And that way you did have some fresh meat in the winter. From there you could collect berries and plums, maple sap from the trees, and also honey. Ashes from the fireplace were used. You would leach them with water, which would produce lye, and then with the clean fat you could make, and salt, you could make soap. Then there was one other item that was quite important to a household, and that was the bread starter. And this is like a sourdough bread starter. It took me a while to put these two together because I didn't think about the pioneers using sourdough, but that's what it would have been. They used cooked potato water, flour, salt, and sugar. Then each time you made bread, you would use a portion of it and then add more flour and sugar. Then you had to add more to your starter so that it would keep growing. And if you did not, if you let it die, you had to go to a neighbor or you started over. Perhaps if you had beer brewing, you could use some of the hops from that, the yeast from that. But that was important to keep going at all times. And I don't know, do any of you remember having a bread starter at home? Both of you?
Some people probably done it themselves. A few years ago, I had a... Well, you start with your, like you said, your water.
Water and your yeast.
It's fun to do.
Yeah, it is, and it's a fermentation product or process, and so it just keeps going.
And going back to this lye and stuff, my folks always make their own hominy because you soaked your corn and put that in.
Oh, they did. Oh, that's interesting. Did you hear that they made their own hominy? Because they would take the corn and soak it in the lye and then use it.
The husk off of the kernel, and then the inside is what is the hominy.
Okay, and then they after you take the husk off,
Then it has to be washed several different times, but then we always do that.
you always did that. That's interesting.
I can remember my mother frying down meat and putting it in a stone jar too, in the flat over the top of it, would seal it.
Oh, to seal it?
Yeah, it would keep kept in our basement for quite a while.
Quite a
And she'd
while.
also put bacon in a jar and seal it. But that was,
After the canning jars
Yeah.
were available,
but it was a way of keeping the bacon.
and keeping the bacon.
I mean, she put fat on it. I can remember taking it to the state fair, cooking it on the open fire.
That's interesting. Also, as I go on through, there's in the methods, when we get to jellies and jams, they would melt down lamb or mutton fat and put on top of the jellies and jams, because I think it's particularly hard. Could you suet? You could use other grease, I think, just so that it seals, is what the idea was. For the methods, we have vegetables. You could use them fresh. You could pickle your vegetables, and this method is a way of storing them in vinegar or vinegar and sugar. And the interesting thing here is that it is a low pH, it's high acid, so no harmful bacteria grow in vinegar. And also if you use sugar, the botulism does not grow in sugar either. So sometimes you might have a cloudy mixture, but that's only yeast, and that would not hurt you. It would still be all right. They would pickle beets, cucumbers, relishes, sauerkraut. And the sauerkraut was done a little bit differently, because you would just put the cabbage in the bottom, then the layer of salt and the cabbage and salt, and then weight it down, and then watch it. Stomp it down and watch it. That was one reason I brought the chow chow, because at the end of the season, you do need a method of taking care of all the leftover vegetables that you can keep. The root cellar was another place to store the vegetables, and they kept fairly well. I mean, even now I'll keep potatoes or squash, and they'll keep quite a long time in the winter, maybe not as long as I think it should, but it keeps. The other method was drying, and I don't know how many of you use drying methods, or if you remember that.
I remember the neighbor doing it.
The neighbor doing it, maybe with the sliced apples or mushrooms or beans or corn, and you'd put them out on either racks or muslin and let it dry. On a screen, okay, on a screen, and it would dry and then bring it in. My mother was saying that the one thing she really disliked the most was taking the beans off of the plant after they had dried just a little bit, and then the peel from the beans was so leathery, so it was just hard to yank it off and work with, but that was her project.
Just bring it on string, on thread and everything, and then there were beans and stuff, and then they were hung in the attic where it was always warm.
Oh, you strung the bean on thread,
So they dried.
and they dried. Oh, that would be a great place, because it would be warm and dark. Yeah.
So we always had vegetables.
Oh, that would be great. They had strung the beans on a thread and put them in the attic so that they would dry, and they would always have them. Were there other things that you did that way?
Well, that's the only thing I remember was on them that way, but for keeping carrots and things, they were either put in straw or sand.
Okay, and sand, yeah. Okay.
Newspapers too.
And newspapers. Did you put those,
Whatever you had,
yeah, whatever you had, did you put those in cold storage? Or they were in cold storage in the basement? Yeah, so it would stay cool winter and summer and not freeze. For fruits, you would have the jellies and jams, and you would process those and then put the fat on top to save them. You also pickled fruits, pickled cherries, pickled crab apples was one method. Also drying the fruits was another. You could dry cherries, we dried the apples, and probably berries. From meat, that was sort of an interesting situation because the butchering was normally done in the early winter, and does that sound right to everyone? Would this be in December or January? Okay, it would be when it was cold enough that the meat would freeze, that it wouldn't perish, because it did take maybe a week to do this whole operation where you've slaughtered the pigs, let's say, and then skinned them and then taken them in and butchered it for roasts, for bacon. Parts were used for head cheese, for everything that you did with them. In order to preserve the meat, they could hang it over the fireplace, and this was hung very high on a rope, and you would turn it, and it would gradually just dry, and then you could preserve it that way. Once it had dried, you would cover it in pepper, and then put muslin around it and sew it up and put it in the cellar again. And according to the reading, that should last about a year. It's sometimes hard to believe, but I know, I've always known that if you've got salamis, I'm so careful to put them in plastic and wrap them up, but sometimes if you just put them in paper, they will dry some, but they will save, they will keep in the refrigerator much longer. Drying was a method with meat. You could have the roast that would either smoke or dry in the chimney. You could make jerky. And another method of drying would be the portable soup, where you would cook down the calf's knuckles or pig's feet, or not the pig's feet, but the calf's feet in a broth and cook it down, and then it makes the jelly. When you get it cooked down just far enough, they would put it in little tea kettles and then just leave it in the house. Probably the attic would have been a better place for it. And when it dries, they ground it and put it in a pouch. Then they could take it maybe on the journey to the grist mill or into town, and then all you needed was to add water, and you had a soup. That was good. Sometimes they would add spices to that. Sometimes they would add mushrooms to it. Another method is potting, and the meat would be pounded for this, and you'd pound it with spices, and then put it in a container and seal it and let it dry. Then there's salting, pickling, and corning. And this is done, the salting would be done with beef, pork, and lamb. The pickling would be pork, and the corning would be beef. And these are all methods of curing. And the difference is the amount of salt that you would use. In some cases, you would take your slab of meat, put it in the bottom, maybe of a barrel, it could be a wooden barrel, it could be a crock, and then put the salt on it, and then another piece of meat. You'll keep going up just like the sauerkraut. Then in some cases, they did add beer, or you could add vinegar, and then keep it submerged. But as another chore for the lady, she did have to keep turning. She had to keep turning these. She had to go down and check them all the time. They were kept in the root cellar to make sure that they were always submerged, and they would keep. Bacon was known as, in some areas, fatback or sow belly, and this was salted, so you would go cut off a slice of bacon, bring it in, and soak it for an hour or so to get the salt out, and then at that point, you would be ready to cook your bacon. Then, of course, in the 1860s, when canning jars were available, they revolutionized a lot of these processes. One thing, and I want to ask you about it, is when I was telling my husband about this, he said, it's really unusual, but at that era, we didn't use, from what we could see, herbs or spices for preserving. Some of the European countries and Middle Eastern countries used a lot of spices and herbs that would preserve. And all the leaves and the aroma, the spice itself is an antioxidant. So that would preserve products. But I don't know, did any of you use a lot of herbs and spices that you can remember?
Dill.
Dill. Oh, you used dill. Yeah. For dill pickles. Yeah. Okay. I had not really talked to anyone that maybe dill, maybe a few herbs, but there didn't seem to be a lot of herbs, even though the books always gives me a long list of herbs and spices. I think some of this was perhaps European influence or depended on the area you lived in. There's just a few home remedies that we have. One would be, and it's not a home remedy, if you didn't have a toothbrush, you could run down to the river and take a stem of the sweet gum tree, maybe 5 inches, and chew on it. And then after you've chewed on it, you could brush your teeth, and it would it would leave your teeth with a clean feeling and also a very sweet aroma in your mouth. If you had cramps, you might possibly have a hot pepper tea, which I think might do more for emotionally making you forget your cramps or your stomach ache, and you're concerned about the hot pepper that you've just swallowed. If you had a cold, you might have a mustard plaster, and this would be dried mustard boiled with water and maybe a little bit of oil, and then maybe an old sock put in it, split open, and then you would put that on your chest, and it was supposed to break up phlegm. It did? It did. Well, it does break up phlegm. And then you could also have a sassafras tea, which might be pleasanter. If you had a boil, you would take the membrane of the inside of an egg, and you would put it over the infected area, and that should draw out the infection. I have a handwritten pneumonia recipe, and that is from it was handwritten in one of the books. 2 of the older books back there are from my girlfriend's grandparents. And this was handwritten, and you have it in your literature, but it was a mixture of alcohol, skunk oil, turpentine, and liniment. And you boiled this together and put your rag in it, and then put that on your chest and just rubbed it in. The skunk oil, I looked that up in my husband's Merck Index, and skunk oil is the fat from a skunk when he's going into the winter, right before he hibernates. So you'd have to find your skunk at that point and then preserve this fat and keep it. So you would have that for the winter. Do any of you remember home remedies that were sort of interesting using? Goose grease? What did you use the goose grease for? On your chest.
And a wool rag over the top.
And a wool rag.
Or rag.
Oh, and that was for a cold or sore throat type?
My grandmother used to make us what we call vinegar slug. I don't know if anybody else has heard of it.
Vinegar slug?
Vinegar slug.
Vinegar
That's what she
slug.
called it. It was like honey and vinegar and water, a little ginger, and just boiled into a little bit of syrup. And I'll still, sometimes I'll even do something like that. It was for sore throat.
Oh, so you gargled it then?
You cook, huh?
You would gargle it then or
No,
swallow it?
Well, it tasted too good. It's too thick to gargle it. You would just take a teaspoon and slowly enjoy it.
And slow. Well, that sounds like a good home remedy with the vinegar and honey and ginger.
What we call cough drop.
Cough drop.
It was liquid.
It was liquid,
Yeah.
but it was thick, and you would just drink it, and it would sort of coat then the inside.
And it didn't have to be real thick.
Honey was
Mhm.
used,
It was honey and vinegar.
yeah, honey was used a lot.
Ginger was,
And ginger was the flavoring. That sounds good.
and water.
And water.
was,
Mhm.
I can remember them tending the beehives, also sitting on one. It's lots of fun.
I think that would be. My husband had beehives at one time. Well, I think this has mainly been life in central Iowa. Probably we're gearing more towards the 1850s, and I was thinking of Plum Grove as being somewhat of a normal home at that era. It might have been a little bit larger than some, but that was my thinking as we're using Plum Grove as a base here, and it's the middle of the century, in central Iowa. And at that time,
Could you explain the caption under this picture?
oh, that picture.
What
That's the
what
one.
it says there, would you explain what in the world that
Oops.
means?
Okay.
It says, while this sad, what is that?
Sad.
What is going on there?
Okay, what's going on in that picture? And let's see, there's something else on that page. Is there the description of the fireplace on that page? Okay, that's why that's there. But I found that picture amusing also. This is a rotisserie process. And what this dog, yeah, that's a huge hunk of meat on a rotisserie in a fireplace. What this dog is doing is going in circles, and he's turning the rotisserie. He's turning the wheel.
Oh, he's enclosed in
Oh,
some
I
way.
see. Oh, I didn't see him down here. He's below.
He's below. Yeah, that's what he's doing, is he's turning in his walking, he's turning the rotisserie.
And then the other question
Mhm.
I had was, when it's talking about the swinging crane.
Yeah, that's-
You said before they used that, they had a bar across, and what did you call that bar?
A lug pole. A
lug.
lug, L-U-G, lug pole.
lug pole?
Yeah, and that was the green piece of wood that was placed in the fireplace.
But you had to replace when it got dry.
Yes, yes. Because I did read of situations where, you know, eventually it dried and would burn, and if you weren't careful or watched closely enough, you've got your pot coming down and spilling, I mean, hot water, food, everything all over. And I can't imagine the mess. Perhaps, you know, everyone got up early in the morning, you kindled the fire, you fed the chickens, and then you might start your breakfast. Bread was made frequently on the same days that you would make butter, so that after you had churned your butter, you would have that fresh butter for the bread. And this was done maybe once a week or twice a week. And the churns, I always think of the old crocks that my grandmother had, like about that size, that you cranked up and down. There were also big barrels that you could turn on the side. And there were, about this size, they were glass. And then they would turn at the top, and had a paddle inside. Then you could at least see what was happening and how far you were with your butter.
You didn't use a glass jar and shake it.
Or you could even just shake it.
That's what we did.
Oh, okay.
We did too.
That simplifies everything, and you can see exactly what you're doing and know when you're ready, when it's all ready. Wash day was probably on Monday. I still wash on Monday, and every other day is wash day. They used as few clothes as possible, and that's why the lady constantly changed her apron, because she didn't wash her dress all the time. She washed the apron, and when she was washing, she had to make the soap, so she's made soap to do that with. Life was also seasonal. Everything revolved around the seasons. When spring came, you had to plant your garden, and then when the fall came, you had to harvest. Then you could have a feast maybe after harvest. When thrashing time came, you did that. In the winter, you would have your butchering process. But they always enjoyed life. After each big event, there would be a celebration connected with it. And I did want to read you just a little bit. This is our rural heritage, and it's a collection of essays and recipes, and it's published by West Branch Heritage Foundation, and it's listed on the book list. This was published in West Branch, and it is at the Hoover Museum. Some of you may have the book, you may have seen it, you've had it. This is the last day of school picnic, and this was a celebration at the end of the school year. The late spring sun shone warmly on the children as they walked down the country lane. The last day of school had arrived, and they were off to school without their dinner pails, because today was the school picnic. Mothers spent all morning preparing the noon picnic meal. The men grudgingly left the spring planting early on this day to wash up and to don clean shirts and overalls. Shortly before noon, the picnic baskets were loaded into the wagons, and off they went to the schoolhouse. All had gathered, men, women, babies, grandparents, pupils, teachers, and friends. The women spread the tablecloths on the grass, Each woman had done her best. Juicy pies, frosted cakes, cookies, potato salad, yellow with eggs, crisp fried chicken, fresh cottage cheese rich with cream, pickled beets, pickled eggs, red salmon salad, crusty homemade bread and butter, slices of pink ham, baked beans smelling of salt pork and brown with molasses, and best of all, lemonade. While food was spread, the menfolk hunkered down on their heels to talk of the weather, progress in the fields, and how the young livestock was doing. The boys played baseball, the girls giggled over secrets and summer plans, and everyone kept an eye on the spread while waiting for the call, "Come to dinner." After a moment of prayer, they were ready to eat. So I think, as you can see from this list of food, the foods were not so different, but it's more the preparations that were really the big difference. So I don't know, do you have something to add? Mm-hmm.
Your name?
That's my name.
Would you tell us how you got your name?
How I got my name. This is a
Born on a
No, I was not born on a Sunday. I was born on Tuesday. This is my grandmother's name. This is my paternal grandmother. She was Italian, and her name was Domenica. Then when I was born, my parents just named me Sunday, which is the translation. And the funny story with that is, I believe that first of all, I was named Sunday Maria, and then my father left the hospital, and my mother didn't like it, so she renamed me Mary Sunday.
Oh. But you have chosen Sunday.
Mm-hmm. I've always gone by Sunday.
Oh, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah, I've always gone by Sunday. Well, do some of you have other things that you might like to add to this, or memories or thoughts? Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Okay.
My mother used to make what she called a farmer's hand lotion, and I've been trying to find the recipe from it. I know it included bay rum and cloves and rose, whatever you call the rose santan, rose.
Mm-hmm. Oh, the rose
and-
hips, rose petals. Yeah, the rose glycerin.
This kind of thing would be in any of your recipe books.
I have not looked for that, but I have two books in the back. One is the White House cookbook, and it has a number of remedies and things like that in it. The other one is a book that has mainly all remedies and ideas, and it could be in there. In talking to one person, I did come across what she called the black ointment. Now, it was not like a hand lotion. This was for scratches. But she said it was just a terrible smelling thing, but she just swore by the fact that tomorrow morning when you woke up after using this, you had no scratches left, and if your fingers needed to grow more, they probably grew. It was wonderful stuff. It smelled terrible, but it was wonderful stuff. So I could look for something like that.
This was definitely a hand lotion.
This was a hand lotion. Well, I could look for something like that. I'm sure that in some of the literature, the White House cookbook that I have back here is the older version, but I have the newer version. And I would think that possibly it would be in a book like that, because the front, maybe 50 pages, deal with remedies and things like this, and how to live. Mm-hmm.
The Iowa State Fair puts out a cookbook every couple of years. I
Uh-huh.
think there are a couple of editions that have sections with things like that in it, old remedies and so on. Possibly the one from the sesquicentennial year would have it, but I know several of them do.
Oh, several of them
That'd be the
do.
source.
Okay. Do you have these books in the historical library?
You know, we have some old books, I don't know if you have the state fair one. You may have better luck looking for the state historical society.
Oh, okay.
But we have some local ones, not so specific.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think eventually you might find that maybe at the State Historical Society or at your office, or just look through that book, you know. Are there other stories or things you want to add? Well, I thank you very much.